The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
Little video on the homestead strike, which is this major lockdown, technically a lockdown, but then members said, well, they're not accepting the offer by Carnegie Steel, and it's their strike. And it's actually a little video about what exactly happened there. Henry Clay Frick, who is managing Carnegie Steel, and Andrew Carnegie, which of course you should at least be familiar with now. Remember, he's the guy who builds Carnegie Steel. He eventually sells it to J.P. Morgan for $400 million. Well, he always had a pretty good reputation as a good boss, but he really didn't like the union, and they wanted to get rid of the union because they didn't want to pay the workers, and they wanted to maximize their profits as much as possible. And so Carnegie leaves the country and goes to his castle in Scotland so that he can claim that he has nothing to do with what has happened. In the end, which of course Frick and Carnegie are in communication with each other. And so, and unfortunately for the workers, it proves to be disastrous.
The United States had an insatiable demand for steel, and at the ready to feed this demand were Andrew Carnegie and his Carnegie Steel Empire. Teenager. Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland and immigrated to the United States as a teenager. Carnegie came from very humble beginnings, but he was an extraordinary business person. Through many well-timed and aggressive decisions, he was able to amass a steel conglomerate that controlled all of the elements needed for steel production. At one point,
Vertical integration.
Carnegie was widely recognized as the wealthiest man on the planet. This wealth did not come by accident. He was a ruthless business person who often exploited labor in an effort to extract more profit. Homestead, Pennsylvania was the site of the labor conflict of 1892. Carnegie Steel was in disagreement with the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers over wages at the Homestead Steelworks plant. Their labor contract was set to expire, and they needed to come to an agreement. The public disagreement revolved around the wage scale for employees. However, the true and underlying reason for the conflict was Carnegie's deep disdain for collective bargaining. He resented any union interference to the operation of his company. He built Carnegie Steel, and he saw it as his right to run it unilaterally. Carnegie ruled with an iron fist and was willing to do anything and everything in his power to defeat the unions. Up to this point, he had successfully thwarted union recognition at every one of his steel mills except the Homestead Steelworks. While his intentions were now well known, he was very conscious of public opinion. He did not want to appear to be a strikebreaker or enemy of labor, and instead pretended to be a champion for labor rights. Carnegie was able to successfully forward his personal agenda while shielding himself from public scrutiny by having his plant manager, Henry Clay Frick, impose his will. Frick and Carnegie had much in common. Frick, too, had come from humble beginnings. He had amassed a sizable fortune through heavy-handed management tactics. He used the same management philosophy with the union, and Carnegie was content to avoid the spotlight in the Homestead matter. Rather than wage a public war, Frick offered a deal that he knew labor could not accept. He bargained in bad faith by offering labor contracts that paid less in spite of ongoing increases to Carnegie Steel profitability. He argued that wages should go down when steel prices fall and rise when steel prices increased. Since wages were already low, workers had little incentive to accept his terms. As anticipated, negotiations broke down and Frick prepared for battle with the Union. Frick ordered the construction of a 3-mile fortification to the perimeter of the Homestead Steelworks by building a 12-foot wooden fence around the facility. He even equipped it with barbed wire and an observation deck. It was more akin to a prison than a steel mill. The fortification caused the workers to nickname the facility Fort Frick. Henry Clay Frick preempted the eventual strike by shutting down the entire mill and locking out all 3,800 workers. In spite of this, union members held a vote and unanimously decided to reject Frick's last proposal and go on strike. The workers anticipated trouble from Frick in the form of union busters. Under the direction of strike leader Hugh O'Donnell, they set up patrols to search for and thwart approaching replacement workers or strikebreakers. They patrolled the Monongahela River in search of incoming parties, since they knew that it was the easiest way to move large quantities of people into town undetected. In addition to being a union member, Hugh O'Donnell was a first-generation Irish immigrant who worked in the mills. O'Donnell was clear that he wanted a peaceful strike, but he warned that scabs would be firmly prevented from entering the mill. Frick reached out to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the largest private security force in the country, for assistance. At one point, it was estimated that there were more Pinkerton detectives than U.S. Army soldiers. Frick wanted the Pinkertons to protect the scabs that he planned to bring in. On July 6, Frick arranged to bring in 2 barges full of Pinkerton agents down the Monongahela River. His goal was to secure the plant and the dock that led to the plant. Once they had secured both, he believed that he could safely bring in replacement workers via the same means. While Frick believed that he could secretly bring in the barges under the cover of darkness, the workers were prepared. Their patrol spotted the Pinkertons as they came up the river and quickly arranged to confront the detectives at the dock. The Union seized the mill by knocking down the fence and rushed to meet the Pinkertons at the foot of the river. As word quickly spread about the incoming forces, the mass of Homestead residents converged upon the river, and their numbers swelled to almost 10,000 men and women. They came armed with any and every type of weapon they could find. As the barges landed, Hugh O'Donnell met the Pinkertons to implore them to retreat. The angry mob grew louder and louder, and O'Donnell knew that there would be bloodshed. He wanted to do everything in his power to avert it. As the Pinkertons began to disembark the barge, a shot was fired. To this day, nobody is entirely sure of who fired that first fateful shot. A melee ensued and chaos took over. Shots rang in from all directions for over 10 minutes. The workers were determined to sink the barges and stop the Pinkertons. They soaked the raft with oil and lit it on fire before they floated it down the river in hopes of igniting one of the barges. They then loaded a rail car with dynamite and rolled it down the hill in hopes of earning a direct strike. They also loaded an old cannon with scrap steel and fired it in the direction of the barges. This effort was not very well coordinated because the cannon inadvertently struck one of the workers as it fired and missed wildly. As both sides suffered losses, they collected themselves to press on. The tugboat that had pulled the barges up the river was loaded with injured Pinkertons and abandoned the remaining detectives in the barges at the end of the river. Stranded and outnumbered, the agents grew increasingly worried and scared. At one point, they presented a white flag at the entrance of the barge, only to have it greeted with more bullets. After 12 more hours of battle, surrender was finally negotiated.
I just want to point out, because you already learned about the Haymarket riot or incident in the past, and it's the labor unrest of the late 19th century that gets so violent. There'll be another issue that or strike that I'll talk about after this. That the public becomes, especially the middle class, and obviously the owners who are the robber barons, everyone's really concerned because incidents like this they feel is really threatening society. You have this large, what's appearing to be an underclass of people who really can't afford to live. They're also largely immigrants, which is worrying to the WASP population, that society, they're really concerned about where is society going. So, and then when it gets violent like this, they really feel like it could shake society apart, and everything that's been achieved, especially like for the middle class, who've really only recently joined the middle class. Remember, most of society before that had been, rural and relatively poor, and so they're afraid that all those gains are going to disappear, and what's going to become of them and society. So, think about that in that light. And then, of course, what some people are trying to do. I talked about the populists, the rural farmers saying we want change, we want regulation, and they're talking about the 8-hour workday to try to appeal to these workers, try and make life better, certainly for them as well. But and then mandatory school, number of years in school to Americanize the children of the immigrants. So those, and that's all going on in the same context, that you have all this unrest and uncertainty, and then trying to say, how can we address this problem?
Promised the Pinkertons that no further harm would come to them. The Pinkertons were unloaded from the barge and led into town. The residents of Homestead lined the 600-yard path on both sides and welcomed the agents with further hostility. The agents were heckled, punched, and kicked all the way into Homestead. They were battered with sticks and stones on their gruesome march through town. They asked for mercy, but the residents were angry and beat them further instead. The tattered and defeated Pinkertons were loaded onto a train and sent out of town. On this same day, the workers set fire to the barges that lay abandoned at the foot of the Monongahela River. In the days after the confrontation, the workers viewed the battle as a victory to their efforts. In their triumph, they rebuilt the wall around the mill and staffed the observation deck to guard against further threats from Frick. They were optimistic that they would emerge victorious in their standoff against Carnegie and Frick. The events that transpired at Homestead were published in newspapers around the country. Public support was divided in both directions. Some were sympathetic to the strife of the workers, while others viewed them as a lawless mob of criminals. When Carnegie received word of what had transpired, he cabled Frick to tell him that he should remain steadfast in his fight and never employ any of the strikers again. He was committed to his victory against the Union and was willing to keep the steel mill at a standstill rather than yield to the Union. Mayor John McLuckie contacted Pennsylvania Governor Robert Pattison to communicate that order was being maintained in town. Carnegie also contacted the governor and exerted considerable political pressure on him to act and remove the strikers from the mill. Governor Pattison found that he had little choice than to acquiesce to Carnegie's demands. On July 12th, 8,500 state militia soldiers arrived in Homestead to enact martial law. They recouped control of the mill and enabled Carnegie to bring in scabs to run the Homestead Steelworks. Over the ensuing months, the Union worked desperately to maintain solidarity. In time, charges were filed against the Union leaders for their participation in the conflict. They were charged with conspiracy and murder for the death of the Pinkerton agents. In just 4 short months, the Union started to crumble under financial demands. Union members began to cross picket lines and attempt to get their jobs back. Unfortunately, most of the workers were blacklisted by Frick and were unable to return to their former jobs. They found that scabs that were eager to take their jobs had easily replaced them.
Okay, so those two terms that he just said, which will certainly show up in the test, blacklisted. So if you're blacklisted, you're not going to be able to get a job at any other similar company because all the business leaders know each other, and they put you on this list. You're going to be forced to move somewhere else, away to find work where people don't know you and where they're not going to have you on any type of list, which could mean hundreds and hundreds of miles away. And then scabs. Are you guys familiar with that term at all? In Detroit, a lot of times we are because of the unions and everything. But it's it's hiring workers who aren't union workers who come in to fill jobs at a time of strikes. So that's scabs.
The straw that broke the camel's back came in the form of one Alexander Berkman, an anarchist who traveled to Pittsburgh to assassinate Frick on a misguided effort to support the Union. It's worth noting that Berkman's ideology was in striking contrast to that of the Union. They did not invite him to Homestead, nor were they aware of his nefarious plans. Berkman made his way to Frick's office and fired upon him at point-blank range. Berkman had never fired a gun before and failed miserably in his conquest. Frick endured a flesh wound to the neck and recovered in time to return to work the following week. While some were pleased to hear of Frick's injury, by and far, the public backlash was negative. The average American had no idea whether Berkman had acted alone or not. This act effectively nullified any remaining public support for the Union. The remaining strikers voted to return to work and join those who had already crossed the picket lines. By 1893, the majority of the strikers had been rehired on Frick's wage terms. The Union had been defeated.
So that is one of the major labor conflicts of the late 19th century. And in general, labor conflicts of this period tend to favor the robber barons and their companies and not the workers. And I had a whole class in graduate school that was just on the history of labor. And it's a really depressing class to take because of all the defeats. It doesn't mean that labor always lost. There was actually a situation with the Great Northern Railway where there had been a strike and it went to arbitration, and the workers actually won, but that's quite unusual. So there's another major strike around the same time period at the Pullman Car Company. The Pullman Company manufactured railroad cars, and they manufacture sleeping cars and passenger cars. And so when, of course, the nation traveled by rail, and often you would have to take long distance trips. If you could afford it, the best way to go would be to book a sleeper car so that you could actually lay down as opposed to sitting up all night, which of course is still possible even today. I took a train trip one time where there were people going all the way to California, and I only went part way, and they were telling me, yep, we're going to be sitting here for 3 days. I was like, oh, that doesn't sound very good to me at all. So the Pullman Car Company had been continually reducing their workers' wages over the course of the early 1890s. By the time you get to 1893, they reduced the rates by 30%. Now, the Pullman Car Company actually is a company town. And company towns are towns that are built around the corporate manufacturing centers. So the industrial site, you have the industrial sites, and then you have the houses that are built by the company and rented to the workers. You have often the businesses can even be owned at times by the companies themselves, and then you would go and buy things. A lot of times if you didn't have cash, you could they would write down how much you owed, and then everything would be deducted. Your rent, your expenses like for food and things like that, supplies, would be deducted from your paycheck. In this period, what Pullman's doing is they're lowering their workers' wages, but they're not lowering the price of the or the cost of the rent of their houses. So it gets to such a terrible situation that they find themselves in, the workers, by 1893, that they go on strike. And what's interesting about this strike is that the nation's railroad workers, actually across the country, their union votes to go on strike to support the Pullman workers and the union of the Pullman workers. And so it turns out to be the very first nationwide strike. Pullman refused to negotiate, and like I said, it eventually leads to the American Railway Union going on strike in support. Now, at this time, it's perfectly legal to do that, and it actually would be legal for other unions to have what's called sympathy strikes for many, many decades in this country until you get to the mid-20th century. And you have a situation, which we'll get to later in the semester, where Congress makes it illegal to have strikes like that. But that was perfectly legal at the time to do. It basically shut down the nation's railways, and it's something that actually is legal in places like France still to this day. And I've been to France a few times, and it always seems like whenever I'm planning a trip to go, all the railway workers go on strike just before I get there, and I'm always like, oh, I'm not going to be able to go anywhere because the railroads are going to be shut down. But somehow they managed to reopen by the time I've gotten there. But yeah, if you pay attention to like the international news, you'll see sometimes that happens in Europe. So the strike ends up being broken due to the violence that occurs when in Chicago the railway workers end up setting fire to the railroad cars that are all backed up and not moving because of the strike. And what happened was they actually destroyed cars that were carrying the mail. And that led to a situation where then troops are sent in because of the destruction of the mail. And that ends up basically breaking the strike. Pullman workers are told that they can get their jobs back as long as they agree no longer to join or be a member of a union. And so that's what happens. And essentially it breaks the union. You can visit Pullman, Illinois today. It's a historical site and museum. And so I've actually, unfortunately, never been there, and it's not that far away to go. But it's an important company town and important part of labor history and industrial history in our nation. So, the 1893 and 1894 are essentially the mid-1890s are significant economically because it's the worst economic downturn of the 19th century. And there had been pretty severe what we would refer to as recessions or depressions or recessions, which of course they called panics at the time. And the Panic of 1893 was especially severe. Eventually you would have 20% unemployment, with the highest ever unemployment figures of the 19th century. But it began in the winter of 1893 when first you have the collapse of two large railroad companies, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad collapsed. One railroad, I think, owned by one railroad company. And then the U.S. gold reserves, which are backing the currency, fell below what was seen as an acceptable amount of gold at the time to be in the federal vaults, below $100 million. And then finally, another big company will collapse. The National Cordage Company collapsed. And that led to the nation's banks becoming very jittery over this whole combination of events that occurred. And they began to call in many of their loans early, and which led to a financial situation in which many companies, of course, were not in a position to be able to pay back their loans. So it leads to this horrible economic situation. Actually, just at the time that the World's Fair began in Chicago, which is really one of the major World's Fairs that was ever held in this country, and which I'll talk about later today. So the panic led to millions losing their jobs. And remember, at a time when there was not any social welfare program. So there's no workman's compensation at this time. There's no Social Security. So there's no backup that if you lose your job, hopefully you had some savings. But remember, most people are working for wages that they can barely survive day to day. It's like a situation that people in third world countries often find themselves in today, that if you don't work, literally your family won't eat. I was in Colombia, South America, about 3 years ago, and I learned how they were the most aggressive vendors that I have ever seen anywhere that I travel anywhere in the world. But I also learned that they were in a situation that our citizens found themselves in the 19th century, is that if they didn't make money that day, they literally could not go buy food to feed their families. And so that's what was going on. So people literally would have no savings, would be forced to move out of their tenement apartments, or the middle class who's being laid off, if they didn't have any savings or didn't have that much savings, would be forced to either lose their house or sell their house and move into an apartment. There's situations in the 19th century where you hear of people who move from larger accommodations to smaller accommodations, and then when they still can't find work, to even smaller accommodations, and then eventually out onto the street. Really not unlike today. Have you guys been paying attention to the news this week about the homeless crisis? Nobody's heard about that? No. A few of you. California has about half the homeless of the entire nation. So it's a huge crisis out there. Of course, I lived in California for a while, and even when I lived out there, it was horrendously expensive, and it's just gotten worse. People who have jobs can't even afford to rent apartments anymore. Little tiny apartments, are costing $2,000-$3,000 a month. So it's a crisis now, and it was a crisis then for people. So as thousands of businesses, 15,000 businesses closed over the course of 4 years, and 200 railroad companies went out of business. So a lot of times when small companies like that go out of business, so what happens is the big companies will end up taking over, buying them up. And so it's not that you necessarily lost routes. It's just bigger corporations were able to swoop in and gobble up these companies when they went broke.
Back then, when the banks, they didn't have what we have now.
Right.
I mean, as far as backup by the government.
Yeah. So Carmelo said, back in the 1890s, there's no backup. So there's no insurance. So if you had your life savings in a bank account in those days, and it closed up, that was the end of your money. You would never see it again, which obviously be terrifying. So, and it's a situation that people often found themselves in the 19th centuries when this happened. And in the 20th century, it's not until the Great Depression in the 1930s that finally they create the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that now will guarantee that up to a certain amount of money, I'm not sure exactly, something to $250,000, which is something I'm never going to have to worry about having in my savings account. But anyway, if you do, they'll guarantee up to that amount of money that you'll get it back. But even then, the question would be when. When it was set up in the 1930s, my great-grandparents luckily when their bank closed was during the crisis that set up the insurance, but they still didn't get their money back till 1949. So they lost their money in 1933, and they didn't get their money back until 1949. Yeah, so terrible situation. And horribly devastating. Literally people living under bridges, like families living under bridges. So which of course is a horrible situation that people find themselves in today. I just, I don't watch I tend to stream my news or whatever, but I actually watched like NBC News last night, and I saw an interview with a guy who lost his job, had a house, lost his job, and had to tell his kids that they were going camping, and they were literally living in their car in the Los Angeles area. And luckily, they're living in a fairly nice shelter that had like a room for them with bunk beds for the whole family. But still, terrible situation that he found himself in, and I guess the administration in Washington wants to take not homeless people that are living in shelters, but homeless people who are living on the street, because there's hundreds of tent cities just in LA alone, and move them to like desert warehouse facilities, which is kind of scary in some ways, you know.
You're gonna feed
Like,
them
I don't know.
shelter
Well, I
them?
imagine, but I mean, that sounds scary, just sort of rounding up people and moving them to
Yeah.
facilities.
Well, police do that.
Wow.
They do.
Yeah.
They arrest somebody, they take them to
But
another
that's
city. and
that's
dump 'em
criminals.
off. No, not criminals, the homeless.
Well,
They'll
yeah.
take them
Unfortunately, a lot of homeless
to a
have mental
different city
problems.
because they don't want the problem.
Right. When I was in graduate school, I was working on a project where they closed all the mental hospitals in the state. And they gave the people bus tickets, and the people that didn't want to go places, they just left out. They opened the doors one day and said goodbye. And I was working on a construction project in Kalamazoo, and all these unfortunate people were just wandering around the streets.
Michigan?
Yeah,
Really?
that was in the 90s.
I know they had a place on Michigan Avenue. They closed
Yeah.
that, but I don't know what happened.
Yeah, there was one in Kalamazoo that closed. Yeah. And Traverse City was a big one too. They closed that. So anyway, the federal government did not have a way to actually try to stop this recession, as we would call it, this panic, to try to shore up the economy. There was not any type of a system in place. It's actually a time in our history when private individuals actually had control of more money than the federal government. And so what happens is that the government asks J.P. Morgan, who is this major New York banker, to try to get his bank and the other New York banks he leads the effort to stop the collapse. And so what he does is that he forms this syndicate between other New York bankers, and they start to buy gold to shore up the lack in the reserves of the Fed. There was no Federal Reserve at the time, but there was gold reserves, and so that then helped to eventually lead the economy to recover. But it takes still a few more years for that to happen, because 1895 is about right in the middle of the panic, as they would have said, the recession. So, but it does at least stop the collapse of the economy. Well, it will lead to the stop of the collapse. So that was a good situation. This J.P. Morgan would actually be called upon again in Panic 1907, so 12 years later, to do the same thing. So it was with these two panics that would eventually lead the federal government to start trying to figure out what they could do so that in the times of severe collapse, they didn't have to turn to private citizens who controlled more money than the federal government did. So. Without any type of system to aid the public, of course, this is at the time of when you had initially the populists who had been demanding government regulation and more government intervention in people's lives, which of course is not successful, but people are thinking along those lines. And you have this really interesting situation with the economy at the unemployment rate at the lowest or the highest percentage of people out of work as ever in history to that point. And so what happens is you have a march on Washington, and the numbers actually fluctuate depending on where they were going. Sometimes people would join and then go back. Sometimes people would go all the way to Washington. By the time they got to Washington, there were about 600 men who were there. They were all unemployed. It's actually led by a guy who's a veteran of the Civil War, and it's the first time that you ever have a march on Washington. And so here's a photograph of some of the guys on their way. It's interesting, some of them have bicycles because the 1890s is in the midst of this huge bicycle craze in the United States. It's only about a decade earlier that bicycles essentially take the form that we are familiar with today. They actually have, they're lower, they have braking systems, and they're called safeties. And so it's interesting that they had that because, so these guys, apparently, it was the first form of personal transportation that was available, that people could actually, like normal kind of middle class people with average paying jobs could save up and buy. So clearly, like some of these people had been doing fairly well until this horrible economic downturn. Yeah, people love bicycles because you could actually, go somewhere without having to walk. 'Cause I think I mentioned before, most people couldn't afford to keep a horse and carriage. It was very expensive. And so this was a great thing, especially if you lived somewhere where there wasn't public transportation. Certainly if you had lived in a city, all the cities had some type of a public system in which you often trolley systems. There was even a type of bus system which existed in the 19th century that they would pull these cars with horses. I can't think of the name of the car offhand, what it was called, but anyway, that did exist in cities. The march was a failure, unfortunately. The men were often arrested or driven out of town by the police in Washington. But what's interesting about it is that it set a precedent. It shows that the public is really, more and more saying that the federal government has to be more involved in our lives and has to take more responsibility at times when there's nobody else left to do it. And I think it's an important thing when you study history to realize, especially I think in our times when you have so much disagreement politically and all these talking heads on the cable news bringing about oftentimes somewhat outrageous ideas, is to actually be educated and know what really happened in history and why things are the way they are. Because oftentimes people are saying, oh, we don't want big government in our lives, we have to get rid, that's a big theme nowadays, right?
Until they need it.
Right? Well, exactly. The reason, what oftentimes you hear people saying on cable news is that you have big government imposing themselves on us, the little people. But if you study history, what you learn is no, it was actually the other way around. It was the little people actually asking the government to become more involved, because it was often the federal government that they believed was the only entity that could handle major problems to help the society in general. And so it was actually just the opposite. And I'm not going to say, obviously, there can be problems. There have been problems. Sometimes, you may have the government putting rules or regulations that might be excessive. But the idea in general has been to try to protect us, from bad stuff happening. Like, the reason why they put the Clean Air and Water Act in back in the 1970s under Nixon is because people were saying, we don't want our children to be drinking contaminated water or breathing in contaminated air. Back in those days, well, the worst situation, of course, was when Lake Erie caught on fire off of the shore of Toledo. That led to people saying something has to be done because why did the lake catch on fire? That is not a good situation. Who's going to want to be anywhere near that water or drink that water? You're not going to be able to. As you know, I think this did come up in one of the previous chapters where they were talking about silver. And there's definitely this question about silver in the last decades of the 19th century. Should some of the currency be in silver and not just have a backing in gold? And actually, you do see laws that were passed and even renewed by Congress in the late 19th century to buy silver. Obviously, there's a lot of silver coming out of the mines in the West. The Comstock Lode, of course, being the most famous one because it was the largest deposit of silver ever discovered in the country. And it was good for business for states that actually had silver mines. So also, there was a belief at the time that if you had a currency that was at least partially backed by silver, it would lead to more inflation. So people who are borrowing money a lot thought that that would be a good thing because they could borrow now and pay back later. If there's inflation, that meant that the money you're paying back later is going to be worth less than the money that you're borrowing today. And so farmers who often rely on borrowing thought that would be a good idea. Oftentimes, people who lived in cities didn't necessarily think that was a good idea. Businessmen believed it was better to keep the currency or inflation down. Obviously, the workers in the cities thought that it would be best because wages are pretty stable. They're definitely not going up. If anything, sometimes like the Pullman workers are going down. And then to have inflation meant that if your wages are going down and prices are going up, that's not going to work out very well for anybody. But it's a big political issue at the time.
What was with the free money? Free silver.
That's free silver. It just means it's just a term that's used at the time, kind of a catchphrase. So that silver should be part of the currency. Or soft money, that's another term that's used at the time. Whenever you hear those terms, or if you're reading about it, they're just referring to silver being part of the backing of the currency. Okay. So Republicans and businessmen, the Republican Party is really has kind of morphed away from the party of Lincoln and the party that protected the freedmen, and it's kind of more becoming the party of business by this time, which traditionally we still think of the Republican Party that way. And the Democratic Party is well, depending on where you are in the country, is either the party of the solid South and the old South and keeping things the way it was, or in the northern industrial cities, the Democratic Party is moving away from their brothers in the South and becoming the party of the underdog, the party of the worker, of the immigrant. And so so in general, it's interesting because depending on where you are would really depend, like physically, like if you're in a city or if you're in the countryside, even though in general you'll see like the major candidates taking one position or the other. So you can say, well, William McKinley is the next slide. He's backing gold. He thinks gold, everything should be stable. And then William Jennings Bryan is backing silver. But it didn't always necessarily mean that if you were a Republican that you were just going to say gold is going to be the best and I never want to have any silver. Or if you're a Democrat, you're going to say silver is going to be good and I don't think that we should have as much gold backing the currency. It really often will depend on economically what you think would be best for you. So if you're a Republican but you're in Colorado, obviously it would be best for Colorado to be selling their silver to a buyer who's going to be like ready, like the federal government. They're just going to be like buying up huge amounts of the silver. That's a great supply. If the Congress was passing laws that would say we have to buy a certain number of millions of dollars worth of silver every year over the course of several years, which they did, and that was great. So if you're a Republican and you're in Colorado, that's going to be good. But if you're a Democrat in, say, a city in New York City, it might not be so good for backing silver if you think it's going to lead to more inflation and therefore make your life harder. So it's an issue that isn't quite black and white, and where everybody's just saying either on one side or the other. There's a lot of nuances, and it's definitely a big political fight at the time. William Jennings Bryan will run for the presidency in 1896. He's the Democrat. He does back silver. So many rural people really wanted more and more silver as part of the currency. But William McKinley, he is the Republican candidate, and he doesn't want that. He really thinks that it's much better to have gold. And so that's sort of a central theme of this election in 1896. And William Jennings Bryan, of course, he's from Nebraska, which is a very rural state then and even now. And so he's backing silver. And he makes this speech it's known as the Cross of Gold speech. And it's considered to be one of the great political speeches in American political history. And he says that the average American, and remember, America is still more rural farmers than it is urban people at this time. And so he's saying the average American is being crucified on a cross of gold. That basically the people in power are really not considering the economic situation that the average person is facing every day. So this is all part of what's come up in the past, is that you have this situation in America during the Gilded Age in which you have 1% to 2% of the population controlling, well over 90% of the wealth, and then there's everybody else. I think I've mentioned this before. People today, really, there's this thought that we're living in a second Gilded Age. I was reading about Bill Gates yesterday. He has $104 billion. So, one person, $104 billion. So, it's the same idea as the robber baron Zen. Who needs $104 billion?
Me?
Yeah. I took my architecture history class to the DIA on Saturday, and there's an exhibition that I went to see after we were done with our tour, doing what I needed to do with those students on the Impressionists, and it was sponsored by a foundation, a guy, I forget his first name, but his last name is Wilson, and he owned some big manufacturing company here in Detroit. And he also owned the Buffalo Bills football team, and they sold it for, I think it said $1.2 billion when he died. But he wanted the money to go to this foundation, and they have to spend the money in 20 years. And so he gave some massive amount of money that was, I think, $100 million the foundation gave, the split between Detroit and Buffalo, New York, to do some type of outdoor programs like trails and things like that. So like a massive amounts of money that he was giving away, which I thought was pretty cool, that, you know, he had this guy that was so rich and just didn't leave it all to his heirs. His heirs aren't going to starve. They had a video with his wife, and she said that because he also owned, really liked art. That's part of the reason why they sponsored that show on the Impressionist paintings, is that he owned some important Impressionist paintings that were sold for tens of millions of dollars as well. And that went to the foundation. And so she said, in total, I think the foundation got about somewhere around $1.2 billion or $1.4 billion. But no, I think out of the $1.4 billion in total that he left, the foundation got something like 90% of it. And so it's not like his heirs were going to starve. They still had a few $100 million, which, you know, they'll be fine.
I was reading an article that they were talking about all these rich people's gates and
Yeah.
a bunch of rich people, and they were saying that they're not leaving all of their fortune to their kids.
Yeah.
They want their kids to get an education
Yeah.
and start their own.
Yeah, I'm sure they're not going to starve. Andrew Carnegie did actually the same thing. He left most of it to his trust, but his family's still doing pretty well, even 100 years after he died. Yeah, Gates and Warren Buffett, they formed that foundation where most of their wealth in the end is going to go to the foundations. The article I was reading was Bill Gates said he would support a wealth tax, but he doesn't think that they'll ever pass one, because it'd be something like 3% a year. So it would have reduced his fortune to eventually, I guess, to about a quarter of what it is. But he'd still have something like $27 billion, which is not bad. This is the last you're going to hear about the People's Party, because they're going to collapse after the 1896 election. They don't do well like they had done only 4 years earlier in the presidential election, because they actually support Bryant, and they make this bad decision of, instead of having their own candidate for the president, they say, oh, we really like everything William Jennings Bryan says, so we're just going to say that he's our candidate as well, and then we're just going to nominate our own vice presidential candidate. That proved to be disastrous politically for them, and they'll collapse after McKinley wins. So McKinley becomes the 25th president of the United States. And we'll hear more about him in future chapters. And this will be, so Grover Cleveland, of course, would leave office. He retired. Grover Cleveland was in actually very poor health by this time. Public didn't know it, but he had cancer of the jaw and had to have a big part of his jawbone removed, and it was, the surgery was done on a yacht, all in secret, because they basically made it look like he was on vacation, and then he had to have this insert that was put into, that he would have to put in there, and then he had to learn to speak again. So he was in really poor health by the time Cleveland left office. And so anyway, Cleveland was, of course, the 22nd and 24th president of the United States. In case you don't remember that, the only president who's to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. And the last Democrat, and the only Democrat in essentially a 50-year period from the time of the Civil War until you get to Wilson's election in the 1908 election. All right. Okay, so I'm going to focus now on the World's Fairs of the 19th century. World's Fairs were important part of social history. They were important ways that nations could actually share their culture, share their technologies, show off to the world how advanced they were at the time. And it was a great way that industrial powers could definitely show off their technology. But it was also a way that other countries that may not have been advanced could come and share their culture. And so World's Fairs had begun in 1851 in England, and then they were being held throughout Europe as well as the United States in the 19th and 20th century. And actually, they're still going on today. There just hasn't been a World's Fair in the United States since the 1980s. They tend to be a money loser historically. The communities that put them on tend not to, it might be good for local businesses, but who's actually paying to have the fair built tends not to be so good. Although sometimes they do make money, or at least make enough money to make it back. I think Chicago was just rejected a few months ago from
Is this going to be on the test?
World's Fairs. World's Fairs always going to be on the test.
No, this isn't in Canvas, is it?
This isn't in Canvas, so.
Okay.
That's a good question. We were trying to figure out a way that I could put it in OneDrive somehow. I'll ask. So this isn't a PowerPoint actually though. So World's Fairs began in London. This guy's name is Joseph Paxton. So I just want to give you a little background to where they came out of. It was actually the brainchild of the Queen of England's husband, that England being the first industrialized nation in the world, could show off its advances to the world and then invite other nations to come and participate as well. And it was all held in 1851 in London in this building. It was designed by Paxton. It looks like a giant 19th century greenhouse because essentially that's what it was. Paxton was a famous gardener who said, why don't we build this big giant glass greenhouse, and you could put it together quickly. It's all cast iron and glass, so it could be prefabricated. Everything could be cut ahead of time and then assembled on the site. So it made sense as a temporary structure that for an exhibition that was only going to take place over the course of a few months. And so it's a really early example of a prefabricated building, which we tend to think of prefabricated buildings as being something very modern, but they've been building them now for about 200 years. This is just a drawing or a painting of the opening when the Queen and her husband, the Prince, came to open the World's Fair. And the United States was invited to participate, so companies like the McCormick Reaper company was asked to participate. McCormick, of course, where the strike had been in Chicago that led to the Haymarket riot, but this is actually the machine that they were producing in those years. Samuel Colt's company that made the famous revolver, they participated as well. Actually, the British were very intrigued by American firearms because we were doing things that was more advanced than anything else going on in Europe or that the British were making. The British even established a commission to investigate American firearms after it was over with because they were kind of miffed that we were doing things better than them. And actually, when the fair was being kind of organized and all the exhibits were being put together, people were making fun of us in England because we had this huge space in the building, but there really wasn't the money to send over a lot of stuff. And so it was a giant hall with just small numbers of tables that were exhibiting American manufactured goods. But what we were exhibiting was really advanced and better than they were doing in Europe. And so they actually started to realize that, oh, America is going to be an industrial power to have to deal with, you know. So making fun of us was one thing, but we were, in the end, we got the last laugh. There was even an American lock company that was able to design a key that could pick a lock that was supposed to be unbreakable. And it was an English lock company had made a Chubbs and Brahms Hobbs lock that was for decades. No company had ever been able to figure out how to unlock it, and an American corporation was able to figure it out. So this is actually a poem that's written at the time of the fair about how they were making fun of us, and so in the beginning it says, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it says, laugh on, good people, never mind, says quiet Yankee Doodle, because they were calling us a goonie, a muffin, a noodle. And then at the end it goes on to say, and you must now be viewed all as having been completely licked by glorious Yankee Doodle. And then, of course, it ended up being true, that within about 25 years, we would be a major industrial power, and we would be competing with all those big British firms, and they would start to take a back seat to us because our corporations were new. We had the latest technologies, whereas back in Europe, where the Industrial Revolution had begun, everything was getting older, and therefore they could not compete as well. Our labor costs, of course, were low. Our access to natural resources were great at the time with the opening of all the railroads and all those mines and forests that you could get cheap goods everywhere you need to bring them. So, and then, of course, the whole business atmosphere with laissez-faire contributed. To the detriment, of course, we always have to remember of the people who are actually doing the work. Yeah. So what happens then 25 years later is the United States will hold its first major World's Fair and introduce itself to the world as the newest industrial nation. And so that's really significant. Well, we actually did mimic the British, I should point out, in 1853, only 2 years after the first World's Fair. We actually built a Crystal Palace of our own in New York City. And but it was not a huge World's Fair like we would hold in 1876. So we already back then were saying, if you're going to do it, we're going to do it. This World's Fair is huge. It's built in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, and it has numerous pavilions. So it had large buildings like the Crystal Palace, and then it also had smaller buildings as well. And so do you think this is just a pretty picture? Yeah. Okay. So, very good. So I wouldn't ask that question if it was. So tell me, from social Darwinism that you learned about in the last unit, what does this picture say? And who are these people? All right. So clearly red, white, blue stars is personification of America, right? The lady with the shield with the lions on it is not as familiar to Americans. Britannia, right? This personification of Great Britain. Okay, and what are they doing? They're standing together as equals, right? Although I'm not sure that if a British artist was drawing this, they might consider us equals to them, but that's a whole other story. But they're standing together as equals. Here's Lady Liberty showing Britannia, look out at what we have done. Of course, because we were a British colony. So here you see the railroads, the steamships, the growing cities with their factories and banks. There's banks.
The factories are in the back, at the top.
And oh wait, I guess mostly just the cities.
Yeah.
I don't see a factory.
No, it's in the back
Oh no,
behind
okay,
the
I'll
Capitol.
tell you about that. So the Capitol, of course, our democratic government, based on essentially British law and all that. And then this is actually the main building at the World's Fair, which is the largest building in the world at the time. So this huge achievement of building this massive structure. And then around Liberty and Britannia are obviously Native American and African, and then I think this is supposed to represent the other colonies in Asia. India, of course, the crown jewel in the British Empire, right? Sun never sets on the empire. Although a student yesterday was pointing out this, which I've actually never talked about before, really talked too much about. Look at Europe here, bathed in white, and what's Africa bathed in?
Yeah,
Backwards.
and that's not a good representation of African person because they didn't really have clothing like that.
Yeah, well, that's artistic license, right? So what are they trying to say? Here we are, England and America, WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? Look at what we've done. We are superior to everybody else. We've conquered the world. So on first glance, you might say, "Oh, what an interesting painting," but in the end, what's it saying of what the WASP, that ideas of social Darwinism that people believe at the time, or so many people do? We learned not everybody does. Jane Addams, of course, has kind of rejected those ideas when she establishes her settlement house. But in some ways, of course, Jane Addams still had those kind of weird things going on. Make sure if you haven't read about Jane Addams, read about her, look her up in the book. So the World's Fair opens in the spring of 1876. President and Mrs. Grant are there, the Supreme Court, members of Congress, officials from around the nation, certainly local officials from the city of Philadelphia. This is actually the art museum that was built for the fair. It's just one of many buildings on the grounds of the fair. And the Emperor and Empress of Brazil are visiting at the time as well, guests of the president. And unfortunately, it was a horrible rainy day. So thousands came out to see the inauguration of the fair. Here's the main building, the largest building in the world at the time. Something like 6 football fields long. And just like the Crystal Palace 25 years earlier in London, it's all cast iron and glass. So it's able to be prefabricated and then assembled relatively quickly for the fair, because again, it's only temporary. It's a temporary structure. It's a building where many of the major corporations here in the United States would have set up their wares, or other corporations that were invited to participate, or countries. Just one of the entrance ways of that main building. And here's an illustration of what the interior looked like. So a massive open interior hall, and then all these walkways and galleries that surround areas along the edge. So the big multi-million-dollar corporations would have set up their displays. It was common, railroad companies that made locomotives would have had locomotives. Western Union would have been displaying all their telegraphic instruments. Western Union had just developed the harmonic telegraph at the time, which was was quite a technological innovation because it actually was able to, they were able to send the sound of the musical scale through the wires. So that's significant. So instead of just having a beep, they were able to have the whole harmonic sound of music. It's actually something that many people have been working on. A guy named Alexander Graham Bell had actually been part of that a team that had been working on it a few years earlier. And Alexander Graham Bell actually gets the idea that maybe you can send more than just the musical scale through a wire, but maybe you can send something more complex like the human voice through a wire. And so then he goes out and starts working on his own to work on that problem. Actually, Western Union began doing the same thing. The guy named Elijah Gray, who works for Western Union and who is instrumental in then developing what was called the harmonic telegraph, was working on the telephone as well. Elijah Gray is there at the time to unveil the harmonic telegraph to the public. Western Union, of course, can pay the high fees that it costs to have a display space down here on the main floor. Alexander Graham Bell and his future father-in-law, who's actually the guy backing Bell, they can only afford a little table somewhere up here to display their telephone. In the end, what proved to be more important, the telephone. Yeah, and but Bell, the story goes, actually was there on the day, opening day there when they're unveiling the harmonic telegraph. The Emperor of Brazil is there, and the Emperor of Brazil actually was very much interested in these technologies apparently, and was apparently at least somewhat interested in schools for the deaf because he had visited the school where Bell was teaching, because Bell was a teacher at a school for the deaf. And the Emperor had gone to that school only shortly before the fair opened and had met Bell. He actually sees Bell in the audience when the harmonic telegraph is being unveiled. And excuse me. And he calls out to Bell and says, "What are you doing here?" And Bell says, "Well, I have this invention that I made, and that you can send the voice through a wire." And so the Emperor says he wants to see it, and so they go, and the Emperor goes, and Gray goes, and everybody follows along, and the Emperor takes one part of the phone. The phone in those days was actually apparently like a big cone, and you would talk into it and listen into it, and it was kind of garbled, like it had what's called a liquid diaphragm, and so it's kind of garbled, apparently like talking underwater, but anyway, you could still apparently understand it somewhat. And so Bell takes his receiver down the hall, and the Emperor takes his receiver and is listening, and the Emperor gets all excited, and then Elijah Gray was with the Emperor, and the Emperor hands it over to Elijah Gray, and the story always went, at least when I first read about it, was that Elijah Gray knew that he was beaten, but because Bell's patent got to the patent office a few hours earlier on the same day that Western Union's and Elijah Gray's patent got to the patent office. In the end, Bell is granted the patent. Western Union isn't. Western Union's this big corporation. They try to buy the patent from Bell. Then Bell doesn't sell. Then they try to sue Bell, and it was a long, drawn out court case. In the end, of course, Bell did win. And so, but anyway, it's an interesting story about how the beginnings of the telephone is really, the first time the public sees it is here at this World's Fair. If you were visiting the World's Fair in the summer of 1876, well, remember, actually, Custer's last stand, the defeat of the 7th Cavalry, had only just taken place shortly before the 4th of July. The whole reason for this fair is to celebrate, not only to introduce the nation to the world as this big industrial power now, but also to celebrate our 100th anniversary. That's why it's called the centennial, and 100th anniversary as a nation. And France gave the Statue of Liberty to the United States as a birthday present. There's great photographs of Statue of Liberty being built in the workshop of the artist that created it in Paris, and it's rising up above all the buildings in Paris. But when she gets here, she's all in crates, and there's no place to put her, and there's no money to assemble her, and there's no money to build a plinth that she's going to sit on. So that actually takes about 10 years. So what you could do that summer is, this is about all you could see of the Statue of Liberty, is her arm. And she's a viewing platform for the World's Fair. So you could pay a small fee, which then is going to help pay for all the expenses to put her together and go up there and look around the fair. The fair wasn't just about technology, although certainly this is a time when there's great interest in making improvements to developing new types of plants and hybrid plants, as well as animals, interest in different farming practices. This is actually the horticultural building, so you could go and see all kinds of, learn about plants and see all kinds of tropical plants as well that came from different places around the world. So there's all different aspects to it. So you could go see art, you could go see, things about botany. You could see all these inventions, all the new technologies. You could learn about canning. Actually, it's said that many Americans first learned how to can themselves, like preserve fruits and vegetables, from actually going to this fair and seeing that process. So even though it was being done, it had been done since around the time of the Civil War, and people were buying things in cans, certainly. But they're learning how to do it right around this period. And apparently this World's Fair is instrumental in promoting home food preservation, and obviously a much safer way to do it than the old ways of just pickling things and putting things in crocks and having air get to stuff. And people were getting botulism and being killed all the time by eating bad food in those days. This is the one of the other big attractions at the World's Fair. It's the Corollas engine. And the Corollas engine is the largest steam engine in the world in 1876, made by the Corollas Manufacturing Company in Providence, Rhode Island. And this drawing is a representation of that opening day of the fair, when the president's there, when the Emperor of Brazil is there. And so presumably this is here President Grant and the Emperor of Brazil seeing a great Corollas engine being started up for the public for the first time. And it was a major attraction. Crowds would gather in the morning to see it starting, and then it would be they would stop it for the dinner hour, which is in those days lunch to us, and then they would start again afternoon, and people loved to see that. It was actually powering all the machines in Machinery Hall. So any of the machinery that needed to be run, actually this giant engine was powering everything. And people were just amazed by that. I think it would have been interesting to actually see it, because I think from our perspective we might think it's interesting, but I think it's somewhat, we're just so blasé about everything nowadays, we just take everything for granted. But this is major leaps are happening technologically speaking in those days, and people's lives have changed so dramatically over the course of, say, 50 years. So,
what was it producing? Electricity?
No, it's just producing energy to power, like say if you have a woodworking machinery, any type of machinery that would need to be powered, that might today be powered by electricity, that would do something that would be part of a manufacturing process. There would be a belt, and then that would hook.
So they had belts.
So there'd be a main drive, and then you could switch a lever and put the belt onto that, and then it would hook up the machinery. Yeah. So, the World's Fair in 1896, so 1876, the very first major one in our country. And then in 1893, you have another one. It was actually supposed to take place in 1892. The whole idea was to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus' so-called discovery, in quotes, because lots of other people, obviously native peoples, knew it was here. But anyway, it's supposed to celebrate Columbus's voyage to the New World. And but unfortunately, it wasn't built in time, and so it opens a year late in 1893. And that's why it's called the World's Columbian Exposition. And it was in Chicago. And it was on the banks of Lake Michigan, south of downtown. This is the Arts and Manufacturing Building, this building here. And it was, in 1893, was the largest building in the world. So every time they get bigger and bigger. This building here is, we'll see a number of pictures of it. It's the administration building, and the dome on it was larger than the dome on the U.S. Capitol. So all the buildings in the main exhibition area were built of steel, had steel frames, but they were covered in plaster. So the main, all the main buildings, as well as there was a railroad terminal, so you could go directly to the fairgrounds by rail. Or you could arrive, this is a dock, you could arrive by steamship. And there's all these lagoons and canals, and so you could take a gondola ride. They banned steam-powered boats because they don't want all the soot from the boats getting all the buildings dirty and all the people dirty. So they, actually electric motors were developed to power the boats in the lagoons and the canals to take tourists around. And it costs $2 to get in, and then anything else you want to do, it's like if you go to a carnival today, like you have to pay extra fees for things. So you first had to pay to get in, then you had to pay to take rides and go on these boat rides, or you could get a sedan chair. If you wanted a sedan chair for a whole day, it cost something like $6 for the whole day. So many times more an average day's wages even. So you know what a sedan chair is? A sedan chair is it can either be simply like, it's usually things that like emperors and kings and popes would be carried around on. So it could be a chair on poles, a fancy chair, or it could be a box with a chair inside, like with a glass and a door, and they carry you around in it. Yeah. I saw one for sale not very long ago, 2 or 3 years ago. I was like, oh man, I want a sedan chair.
So what is these buildings? Is anything left
I'll get
of these buildings?
I'll get to that. Oh,
Oh.
no. Well, yeah, sort of. Some of it. This is the Midway Palaisance, by the way. So all the carnivals, of course, nowadays have midways, and where we go and play the games, and win the teddy bears and stuff like that. And this is the first. And the midway was where all the fun was happening. This is where the little villages, like countries from around the world would be invited. And then they would come and build traditional buildings, like huts or houses, however the people lived, like Lapland. There was a Lapland village. And people would actually live in those houses. And it was like taking a tour around the world. If you've ever gone to Epcot Center at Disney World, it's kind of, it's actually supposed to represent a World's Fair. And that was kind of the idea when they built it back in the 1980s. So you could go to, there were like beer halls, there was a German beer hall, so everyone would be dressed up in lederhosen, and they'd be selling bratwurst and Wiener Schnitzel and big things of beer. So you know, all these different countries from around the world that were represented. And people loved going to the Midway. You could take camel rides, or you could go up in a balloon. You could ride on a movable walkway, which was amazing for that time period. This is the walkway when you got, it's still under construction when this photograph was taken, but when you would dock here on Lake Michigan, you could pay a small fee, like a nickel, and then it would take you up to the entrance gates. Apparently it had technical problems a lot, because it's wood. It's not like when you go to the airport, you know, and it's a big rubber walkway.
Yeah.
So that's a ticket. There are often special theme days where they would host people from different states. So this is the ticket for Manhattan Day. Here's a photograph of, this is the administration building with its dome. It's bigger than the Capitol dome in Washington. Statue of the Republic. Actually, if you were to go to Jackson Park, it was all built in Jackson Park, south of downtown Chicago. And so if you go there today, looking for the fair, which I did a few years ago, well, the Museum of Science and Industry that survives. That was the art museum at the time. And then this statue is known as the Statue of the Republic. So a statue of essentially representing the United States. She sits here where the administration building is today. This is all open fields. It's all open fields over here. And there's a road that leads down, and there's a traffic circle that goes around here.
So that building's still there?
No, that's gone.
Oh, that's gone now too.
So 1893 is the year that the panic starts. The economy in Chicago is in terrible shape. And that winter, many of the carpenters and construction guys who worked in construction to build the fair, they became homeless, and they end up moving into the abandoned buildings on the fairgrounds. And it was an especially cold and brutal winter. Chicago is always bad in the winter anyway. And a fire, they would have fires, of course, to try to keep themselves warm. And one of them got out of control, and it burned almost the entire fairgrounds down, which is really too bad because there were a lot of people trying to save it. Like, everyone recognized that this was really special and that there should be a reuse for these buildings and not tear it down, as what always happened with World's Fairs. They generally got swept away. But unfortunately, that was never to be. So the Manufacturer and Liberal Arts Building, or the Arts and Manufacturing Building that I said was the largest building in the world at the time, and it had all these arches here, and in the entryways on various points of the building where those arches were paintings, and these are photographs of two of them that were there in the entryways, and they were done by a artist who grew up in Detroit. His name was Gary Melchers, and then he was very famous at the time. He spent much of his career in Europe. So anyway, they were sold off after the fair was over with, and the University of Michigan got them, and they're in the graduate library today. So a little bit of the fair. When I travel around the country, I'm always coming across different things. I was at a wedding. A friend of mine got married about 10 years ago, and I was at a wedding in Detroit. I'm sitting in the pew waiting for the wedding to start, and I'm reading this little brochure that the church had, and it said, "The stained glass windows won a grand prize at the World's Fair in 1893. So I'm always finding things. There's just another photograph. All the major artists and architects in the United States at the time were actually commissioned to design buildings or to create works of art for the fair. And many of the works of art actually still remain in the Chicago area and decorate various parks or whatever. Pieces were sold off. I was actually doing research when I did my thesis in Chicago in the 90s, and I was in Oak Park, Illinois, and this house had a little building in their yard, and I came to find out that it was a ticket booth from the World's Fair. Here's the interior of one of the buildings. Egypt had a pavilion that was inside one of the buildings. Many countries chose to build buildings on the grounds that were outside. And Egypt, this is the Egyptian pavilion, and it was inscribed somewhere on the building or inside the building that said, from the oldest nation in the world to the youngest nation, we send you morning greetings. You could ride around the fairgrounds on a recreation of a very, very early American locomotive that pulled a bunch of cars behind it. It was called the DeWitt Clinton, and unfortunately it had exploded about 60-some years earlier, and it didn't survive anymore, but it was thought that it'd be nice to show a recreated American locomotive from the very early days of train transportation. And so it was reused at other World's Fairs in the early 20th century. And then Henry Ford bought it. And so that's where I took this picture. It's in the museum there in Dearborn. Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse both vied to get the contract to electrify the fair. And Edison lost. And Westinghouse and Tesla, who's the great inventor, who's really made Westinghouse so successful. Westinghouse, by the way, was actually a multimillionaire already because he had invented the air brake that allowed for the trains to stop. You'd be able to pull a lever and the air brake would stop everything at the right time, whereas you wouldn't have to have brakemen jumping from car to car, pulling a lever. And so Westinghouse went into the electricity business, but he's interested in AC power, alternating current, whereas Edison was interested in DC power, direct current. Direct current is not especially practical because you have to build a power plant about every mile to provide electricity, whereas AC power can generate high voltage electricity and then it can be stepped down. And whereas DC power, the electricity is always at the same voltage. And it's the time of the electric wars, by the way. Edison is trying to discredit Westinghouse. And he's got his guys going around the country electrocuting animals. Have you guys heard about the story at all?
Yeah.
Yeah, a few of you have. Yeah, so there's a couple of bad stories. An elephant who had killed its trainer was ordered, the circus was ordered to kill the elephant, and Edison stepped in and said, we'll do it, and they electrified the elephant. They built a big metal plate and electrocuted it, and then they developed the electric chair to electrocute prisoners and to show how dangerous AC power was, which of course electricity is dangerous no matter what kind it is, but Edison knows that it's going to be damaging for him if they have to switch over to AC power. In the end, they had to switch over to AC power because Tesla is able to show that AC power is much more practical. Can you imagine if they had to build a power plant every mile, how cities were dirty enough, let alone belching out even more soot? But this is we're part of the Edison display, and it's actually a giant music box. So essentially, it's like a harmonic telegraph. Actually, Edison was working on developing so that you could send more than one message across the telegraph lines anyway. That's part of his contribution to telegraphs. But anyway, it's a big music box, and it played music, and all the lights are different colors, and they pulsated to the rhythm of the music. And so people thought that was pretty amazing. The Great Ferris Wheel is about 240 feet tall. It could hold 60 people standing up in each car. So it's about the size of this room, each car. And it was the largest Ferris wheel, the very first Ferris wheel ever made. and it's the largest Ferris wheel in the world. And for over a century, there was no other Ferris wheel that was bigger than it. Although there's been some pretty big ones that were built. The one in London, the Millennium Wheel. The one in Vegas is now the largest. It's twice as big as this Ferris wheel, the one in Vegas that opened a few years ago. But it was a huge attraction. The fair organizers, the businessmen of Chicago who paid for this, wanted the Ferris wheel. They wanted to have. They thought this was a crazy idea. Actually, they didn't think it could be built. And George Ferris, who's from Pittsburgh, he's owns a manufacturing company. He keeps proposing it. They keep rejecting him. Finally, on the third time, in the winter of 1893, just a few months before the fair opened, they finally said, go ahead and build it, because they couldn't agree on anything else. They wanted something that would rival the Eiffel Tower from the 1889 Paris World's Fair, just a few years earlier. And so Ferris had to build it all from scratch. Nothing like this had ever been attempted. And it opens a few weeks after the fair opened, but and was still able to make a profit. So people loved it, even though it cost 50 cents to ride on it, so it was quite expensive. So you pay $2 to get in, then you got to pay 50 cents to go on. And they said sometimes people would go on it and then go back and pay another 50 cents and go. They just thought it was the most amazing thing. It was all screened in, and every car had an attendant. And they were determined, this is what they said, that no hysterical woman would throw herself from it. Because in the late 19th century is a time when women suffered from what they called hysteria. I think what we would call it today is that they had a breakdown. And I think we have to remember the type of world that women live in at this time, in which they are generally repressed. They wear clothing that is very restrictive. They have to wear corsets that deform their bodies, often deform their children when they're pregnant, and children are born with birth defects because of that. And so women in those days would take to their rooms for weeks or months, sometimes throw themselves under trolley cars and commit suicide. And so there's this thing in society. They're very concerned about hysteria, which is affecting women. But I think from our perspective nowadays, we can probably say, well, there's reasons why so many women are having what we would call a breakdown. It's because of other things going on in society as well. But yeah, so that's great Ferris wheel. It would actually be purchased by a group of investors, and they were going to start a theme park, or essentially a theme park around it. But because of the panic of 1893 and the economy got so bad that their plans fell through, they were able to assemble it again for the 1901 St. Louis World's Fair. And then unfortunately after that World's Fair, it was dynamited and sold for scrap. Fair is lit both inside and out. Edison really tried to do everything that he could to stop Westinghouse from being successful, since he didn't get the contract. He got a judge to order an injunction that the light bulbs couldn't be the type of socket that Edison had designed for them to screw into. So Westinghouse, they had to come up with a new type of insert that you could put the light bulb in. And so it was type of a clip where it would snap into the socket instead of screw into it. But in the end, Westinghouse is successful. American cities are only just really beginning to electrify. So there's not a lot of electricity yet in the country, or at least anything to this scale. So what's amazing to the people who visit the fair is how much electricity, how much light there is everywhere, inside the buildings, outside the buildings. Really, you can see just how bright it is, very much to the standard that we would be used to, say, in urban areas today. And on top of that, on top of the buildings, there were spotlights. You don't see spotlights very often anymore, but they're a type of an arc light, it's called, in which you have bolts of carbon. Actually, the way that the old-time movie projectors worked were like that, and where you would have these bolts of carbon that would shoot a bolt of bright light between the carbon as they move towards each other and burn down. And they would shine these huge beams of light into the sky. And so that was even going on, and people were just amazed by it. Actually, if you did have public lighting in cities in those days, oftentimes municipalities would have an arc light, and they would be up on a big pole and they would shine down, but they usually didn't have that many of them, and they would shine out. Detroit had one down somewhere by Grand Circus Park, and it was on a pole that was about 300 feet high, and it had this really bright arc light up there, and people said it lit the heavens more than it lit the streets. Here's a drawing of the Midway Plaisance. You can see the Ferris wheel in the back. You could also rent these what they call lolling chairs. They were essentially wheelchairs, so if you didn't want to walk all day long, you could hire an attendant to push you through the fair. And then you'd meet all kinds of people. Like here's a guy from the Middle East who's probably from one of the villages. You know, see this guy here wearing his traditional clothing. And so it would be really very exotic. And at a time, of course, before television, and that, you know, people, the only thing that they usually know about the rest of the world is from what they read in books. So before TV, before radio, and really before the movies even. So it's really quite an experience to see the fair. Oh, we're out of time. Shoot. Okay, well, I'll finish this up when I see you guys next week. And I'm going to talk about the Gilded Age as well when I see you guys next week.
Good luck with today's lesson.